Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. What is the point of the modern-day diplomat? Theirs is a world of fortified embassies, chauffeured limousines, and elaborate protocol. But in this globalized internet age, what kind of value do they add? Well, my guest today has been addressing that very question. Tom Fletcher was appointed British ambassador to Lebanon at the tender age of 36. 5 years on, he's just written an operational review of the British Foreign Office. Is diplomacy, as we know it, dead? Tom Fletcher, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Here's a proposition for you that diplomats are only as influential, as powerful as the nation states that they represent. And right now, nation states as a whole, as a generalization, are becoming less powerful, less effective. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think a lot of power is now being transferred away from the nation state, away from hierarchies, away from traditional sources of authority, towards individuals. And so diplomacy that has always attached itself to power has got to adjust where it gets that power from. And so diplomacy is changing too.
Diplomacy changing, but isn't it time to acknowledge that actually a lot of what the diplomat does, the traditional stuff of diplomacy, is now irrelevant?
No, I would completely reject that. I think there's this image of diplomats that is sort of stuck in the public consciousness around the kind of Ferrero Rocher reception, the Rolls Royce, the James Bond lolling at the bar, the martinis. All of that is as far removed from my experience of diplomacy as you could imagine. The reality is we have people out there in very tough situations, conflict situations, getting Brits out of trouble. You know, there is very little Ferrero Rocher involved.
Well, let's leave aside the chocolates and let's look at what you've actually reflected upon, because you've written extensively about your time as ambassador in Lebanon, and you wrote this: I felt power draining through my fingers as an ambassador. Governments becoming weaker compared to other sources of power, and within governments, diplomats are becoming weaker compared to other bits of government. That suggests to me a deep level of frustration within you at the sort of job you were being asked to do.
Well, I mean, look, I'm passionate about diplomacy, and I believe very strongly in our ability to make the world a better place and to promote coexistence, which we've been doing as diplomats since the first caveman put down a club and started collaborating to work together for resource with another caveman. But it is getting tougher because we're competing with many other sources of influence. You know, Google has its own foreign policy. Microsoft has its own foreign policy. Big media corporations, the BBC has its own foreign policy, dare I say. And so we have to fight harder for that space.
It seems to me that your experience, both as a diplomat in the field and based at number 10 Downing Street, representing or giving advice to the Prime Minister, suggests that more and more embassies, diplomats in the field, don't really matter, because there is a centralization of power, and we see it in the White House, we see it at number 10 Downing Street, we see it in the Kremlin and in Beijing too, that actually the projection of the brand, the message of a nation, comes from the centralized point of power, not from any embassy.
There have always been phases where people reckoned that was the case, and also phases of technological change.
You know it's the case because you said at the time that you felt yourself to be essentially more spin doctor than diplomat when you were in number 10.
No, I felt that we were constrained by the demands of a 24/7 media. But I also felt that there was enormous amounts we could do from number 10 to promote British policy. And you still have in the Foreign Office, in the diplomatic network, an unparalleled network of people who can help you have a world view because they've actually viewed the world. And that's the strength of the organisation.
Yeah, I don't know whether you know him, but the New York Times recently wrote a very interesting profile of a guy called Ben Rhodes, late 30s, an extraordinary tyro individual who is Director of Strategic Communications within the National Security Council inside the White House for Barack Obama. The New York Times says, in essence, he is the most powerful voice in US foreign policy making outside of the president himself. And he said this recently. He said, you know what, look at the reality of today. US newspapers used to have foreign bureaus, now they don't. They call us, journalists call us to explain what is happening in Moscow and in Cairo. Most outlets are reporting on world events from Washington. The average reporter we talk to is barely out of their 20s, they have very little experience, and therefore the White House feels it can shape and drive the news agenda. Did you feel that too?
No, I mean, I think what you're trying to do is always to get in the story in the right way and explain your policy in the right way. And when I started, we were doing that by trying to get the right message on the ticker at the bottom of your screen on the BBC. By the time I left Number 10, we were trying to do that by getting the right tweet out there, trying to define our policy in a tweet. But you still rely massively, especially in the field, on journalists who know the situation on the ground, on your network, on your contacts. So I don't think it's possible for anyone to shape the story in the way that Ben was suggesting there.
If we think about social media platforms, I can't think of certainly any British diplomat, maybe any international diplomat who was more assiduous in the use of social media than you. I think you sent more than 10,000 tweets while you were in Lebanon. Suggest to me you were more concerned with sort of living a reality diplomat life than you were doing any meaningful diplomacy.
For me, this was meaningful diplomacy. If you look at the Middle East now, there's a massive battle for the hearts and minds of people across the region, and that debate is happening on social media. So there are many risks to being in there in the way you described. And one risk to me was that the smartphone I was engaging on was also the device by which terrorists were tracking my movements. But if you're a diplomat, you've got to be in those arguments. And the biggest risk is to leave that space clear to our opponents.
You've got to be in the arguments, you say, and you sort of suggest that you felt your constant tweeting, and it has to be said a lot of it was about, frankly, fun you were having, charity walks you were taking, flights with the Red Arrows display team, all sorts of stuff you were having a great deal of fun with in Lebanon. You seem to suggest that somehow that was presenting a different set of values, a different and alternative sort of cultural, political message from that posed by extremists, including those from IS, as though your Twitter feed could somehow counter the propaganda coming from Islamic State. I mean, what a load of nonsense.
So, I mean, I won't claim that every single tweet I sent was taking on Daesh, Islamic State directly. But I would like to say, if you add up those 10,000 tweets, you will get a strong sense of Britain's place in the world, our prosperity offer, our focus on stability, but also our wider values and our support for Lebanon. It was only by tweeting in a hopefully entertaining way at times that I could connect with people in order to get our message across.
But you had about 50,000 followers. Let's be charitable and say some of those were Lebanese. Let's be even more charitable and say they weren't all articulate, elite, English-speaking Lebanese. There is still absolutely no way whatsoever that the kind of disaffected, angry, alienated youth in Lebanon or anywhere in the Middle East who might be considering the attractions of Islamic State, there's no way they're going to see a few tweets from the British ambassador in Lebanon and think, oh, you know what, I've changed my mind, I'm very attracted by the Western lifestyle.
Well, I mean, actually now you can assess the number of your followers who come from which area. About 30,000 of my followers were from Lebanon, and they weren't all hanging out at embassy parties. They were people I wouldn't have otherwise reached. Let me just give you one example.
They were reading you in English, weren't they?
They were reading me in English.
Were you typing away in Arabic?
No, they were reading me in English. These were English speakers, as are many of those who are being radicalised at the moment. But one example, when the Iranian embassy was blown up in the centre of Beirut, we didn't have diplomatic relations. I couldn't go down there and express my condolences. So I went down and donated blood, and the photo went viral in Iran. It was retweeted by Rouhani. And that, I'm not going to say there's a link between that and the Iran deal,
with all due respect, it's a stunt.
Challenge.
You're the Kim Kardashian of modern-day diplomacy. I mean, you live a reality TV lifestyle to a certain extent while you're in your embassy in Beirut, but you're not really doing what diplomats have traditionally done and seen as their most important work. That is highly confidential, secret work on the most difficult issues to try and defuse tensions and avoid conflict.
The tweeting, the social media is the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't replace that substantive work behind the scenes. You know, a lot of what I'm tweeting about is the work we were doing on the border, building watchtowers that were keeping Islamic State on the other side of the border. I was tweeting about the fact that we got textbooks to every child in the country. And I was tweeting about the politics. it wasn't just some gimmicky stunt. I was actually tweeting day by day about the controversial political debates inside Lebanon.
You know, I use Twitter, not as assiduously as you, 140 characters. Let's not carried away by the sorts of profound messages you can deliver by Twitter. I want to quote you the words of Nicholas Carr, who's written a fascinating book, The Glass Cage, How Our Computers Are Changing Us. And he says this: social media favours the bitty over the meaty, the cutting over the considered. It also prizes emotionalism over reason. The more visceral the message, the more quickly it circulates. And that, I put it to you, is why Islamic State is always going to get more out of social media and platforms like Twitter than you are.
I think there's something in that. I mean, I think social media does empower the bad guys. It empowers the outraged.
The extremes, those who want to provoke, those who have a simple, clear message, not the diplomats who confess that the world is complicated.
Yeah, and it suits people like Donald Trump, who just want to be in every argument and whose answer to the 21st century is just to build a bigger wall.
And who is the first real Twitter politician.
Yeah.
He's leveraged Twitter to create an amazing national campaign.
He's using it in an authentic way, so people respond to what he says because they feel it's the real Donald Trump.
And
now,
you want to be that kind of, you want to be a Donald Trump of diplomacy, do you?
But I don't want to leave that space to Donald Trump. I don't want to leave that space to
But the point is,
Islamic
Donald
State.
Trump's got something like 4 or 5 million followers. You have 50,000.
I reckon I've got more followers than he has in Lebanon. So in the arguments over Lebanon,
but this isn't just about Lebanon. This is about the future, without being too grandiose, the future of the world, about how messages get out there, about how people like you who care, and you said in your first answer, you know, you're one of these guys who actually cares about the world and how we govern it. Your approach to the message is never going to compete with Donald Trump's because you're too even-handed and he's not interested in being even-handed.
I'm not going to claim that I'm going to suddenly be able to take on Donald Trump on social media, but there are millions of people out there who are doing that. And they're not all in diplomacy. Many of them are what I'd call citizen diplomats. They're journalists, they're in NGOs, they're individual campaigners, they're in communities. And it's those voices that we need to ensure social media empowers. The problem is that too many of those people now are distracted by cute cats or Justin Bieber's hair.
Yeah, you have created a bit of a stir in the diplomatic world, particularly in the UK, because, you know, you've got a lot of followers, relatively speaking. You've made a bit of noise. You've written a book which talks about your digital approach to diplomacy. There are those inside the Foreign Office and recently left who really rather resent, I think, what you're saying. Just to quote one, it's not personal, but he's considered, I think, your message, and he doesn't agree with you. Oliver Miles, former ambassador in Libya and elsewhere, I think Athens as well, he says, we need to consider very carefully what ambassadors are for. They're not super journalists or blogging super agony aunts. Their job is to advise governments seriously on policy and to provide, this is important, discreet, reliable channels of communication between governments. You don't believe in discretion.
I do. And 90% of what I was doing in Lebanon was very discreet. The conversations I was having with Lebanese warlords day in, day out about the political situation, the advice I was giving on the Syria crisis, that's all very discreet. There are no tweets about that.
But you're constantly banging on about how everything has to be opened up to the public, how transparency and accountability means that diplomats have to give to the public much more information.
I want a more honest way of talking to the public about what we're doing. But I agree with Oliver, there is still a place for that confidential channel, and that's a huge part of what diplomats do. And I'm not saying we should throw away.
It's the most important part of what they do, because if there isn't that confidentiality and therefore that mutual trust between antagonistic parties that neither will rat on the other and spill the beans, then no difficult issue is ever going to be compromised on.
Absolutely. And look at the Iran deal. The Iran deal was done away from social media.
Look at I as a journalist covered the Oslo peace process. Until the news broke, carefully delivered, that the Israelis and the Palestinians had spent months, if not years, talking under Norwegian auspices to get a deal on a two-state solution. And we're talking now 1992, many, many years ago. If the secrecy hadn't been there, Rabin, Peres, Arafat would never have got close to that deal.
And a huge part of what we do has to remain secret, has to remain confidential. What I'm saying is that the social media allows you a different way of communicating what you're doing to the public, of making the public feel more engaged and more involved in those policy-making decisions.
Let's go back to the beginning and me talking about the extent to which you feel that diplomats have sort of hemorrhaged influence because nation-states aren't as powerful. The truth is, the really influential, powerful nation-states still invest in hard power. It is the hard power, the military power and the ability to impose serious economic sanctions that gives diplomats in difficult situations the leverage they need.
Yeah.
Agreed?
Absolutely. It's the heart. I mean, that's why the 2% that we're spending on defence is so important. Actually, it's why the 0.7% we're spending on development is important as well, because that's also part of how you project power. But I'd add to that the wider soft power that we as the UK can deploy, which is everything from James Bond to David Beckham to the royal family. This is all part of the toolkit of options you have as a British diplomat. And yeah, without the hard power, without the economic power, then you can't do all of the negotiations.
So would you agree then with another review, not your review of sort of process in the Foreign Office, but another view of Britain's reach in the world that was led by people like Sir Christopher Mayer, former ambassador in Washington, Dame Pauline Jevell-Jones, former chief of Internal Security Service here in the UK. They concluded, and I'm quoting, "Britain is suffering a crisis of confidence in foreign policy that leaves it, quote, sidelined in Syria, ineffective in Ukraine, unwilling in Europe, and inimical toward refugees." You agree?
No, I don't actually. And I'm not going to be one more kind of former diplomat going around saying how much better life would be if I was still in charge. We're doing
you're
a huge
supposed to be the
amount.
naked diplomat. You're
Yes,
supposed to be the guy
which is why I'm going to be
who
honest with
actually
you.
is frank and truthful. And it sounds to me like you're about to sort of give a woolly answer, saying, "Oh, you know what, we in
Not
Britain are
at all.
still punching above our weight."
Well, take our role in Lebanon, for example. There's no way we were bystanders, onlookers in Lebanon. We were fortifying that border, we were getting education into the schools, and we were in all the major political
Britain
arguments.
doesn't matter in Lebanon. Who are you trying to kid?
Well, ask 4 million Lebanese whether we mattered over the last 4 years, in fact, whether we mattered over the last 10 years, and you get a very different answer.
You don't think that your perspective is slightly skewed because you happen to be sitting in the very comfortable British embassy?
I don't. I was very rarely sitting in the very comfortable British embassy. I was out and about interacting with Lebanese, taking part in those big arguments they were facing.
But the point that these very esteemed formers make is that, look at, for example, Ukraine. Vladimir Putin challenges the European Union, the West, of course, including the UK. You know, we say to him, don't even think about moving your troops into Crimea, and certainly don't think about putting anybody in eastern Ukraine. What does he do? He annexes Crimea. He basically calls the shots in eastern Ukraine. What do? We impose a few sanctions, which frankly are not as strong as they could be, and we, in the end, have to accept his status quo.
Well, you know, I've talked a lot about 21st century diplomacy. Putin is a kind of 19th century statesman, and it's very effective. And
no, maybe he's the real 21st century diplomat because he understands, first, the realities of hard power, and he understands that for all of your tweeting about your entertaining of social life in Lebanon, that actually propaganda is what matters, and he has the most sophisticated, centralized system of propaganda.
Well, a large part of that propaganda is the way that the Russians use social media as well. So they've
Sure,
clearly
but
decided that this is part of the weaponry for them, and it's something we have to use back.
Yeah, but your kind of use of social media is not what Vladimir Putin's interested in. Yours is sort of slice of life stuff, and you know, here's what I did yesterday. His is much more thoroughly, one could say, cynically controlled to deliver a national security outcome.
Let's see. I would hope that what we were doing with social media was
he believes in
projecting...
propaganda. Do you believe in propaganda? Is that what you call your tweeting?
No. But one man's propaganda is another man's spin, is another man's public diplomacy. What we're all trying to do is communicate our national message, our national brand. And I hope that...
So you're not really honest and frank, because a minute ago you seemed to be suggesting to me that, you know, for you it really was a chance for self-expression, to be accountable and transparent, but now you're suggesting to me that you're driven by national interest.
I don't think the two things are incompatible.
Oh, really?
I feel very comfortable, very authentic, talking passionately about Britain's role in the world. I never felt there was a contradiction between that and being honest and open on social media.
What if you did feel a contradiction? What if you sincerely felt that something the British government was doing while you were in their pay and in their service as an ambassador was actually just plain wrong? Would you tweet that out?
You would probably find me being silent on it.
So when you call yourself the naked diplomat, i.e. implication, I tell the truth, I don't cover things up, I am the real deal, you're not.
Yeah, but ultimately you work for a government. I mean, you can't have everyone going around just basically spraying out their views on everything in the world.
Well, don't call yourself the naked diplomat then. Don't give this impression that you're different.
The naked diplomat is not about suddenly being completely open about everything in the world. It's about trying to move the conversation in that direction, about being more open, more authentic, more engaging than we have been in the past.
More truthful?
And more truthful, absolutely. So take Syria. I wouldn't put statements out saying, I feel grave concern about the situation in Syria. I'd say, honestly, I'm outraged. I'm angry about what's happening, what Assad is doing to his people. I'd try and use language that reflected language everyone else used, rather than hiding behind the platitudes.
If you felt that the decision taken by the British Parliament at the time, they were going back a couple of years now, not to engage in the bombing with the Americans, would you tweet that out too? I
wouldn't tweet something on which I disagreed with the government, no, because ultimately I'm a representative of the government, and that, above all, was my role as an ambassador, as a diplomat.
It is interesting that you've now, I believe, been hired by the United Nations. You've had a review of the British Foreign Office's operational capabilities and its future, and now the UN want you to do the same for them. When you look at the way in which the UN tries to wield influence and power in the international arena today, do you see the UN being an effective institution?
No, I'm worried. I'm worried that we've subcontracted a huge number of these big global problems to the UN, and it's really struggling. I think its own people admit that it's struggling. It's got too big, it's incoherent, it's not sufficiently engaged with broader public opinion. And what we're trying to do through that review is try and work out how can we use these new tools, the smartphone superpower that we have now.
The digital diplomacy that you talk about, part of it.
To reconnect the UN
but isn't there
to its basic purpose.
Isn't there something much more basic that's problematic at the UN? That is that the power centre is the Security Council. And inside the Security Council, you've got 5 permanent members, all of whom can wield a veto whenever they want. And because of that, the entire institution is, on the most difficult and contentious issues, hamstrung.
Yeah. And that, you see that in the Middle East. I mean, that's been a big problem we've had over Syria, where Russia has wielded its veto pretty much indiscriminately to protect its guy. You see it on Israel-Palestine, where the Americans have wielded their veto. It is a challenge.
Christopher Mayer, to quote him again, he says, look at everything, recent challenges from Syria to Ukraine to the migrant crisis. He says, in key matters of war and peace, the UN has proved well nigh useless.
I wouldn't go that far at all. I mean, you look at the way the UN is running the humanitarian effort at the moment. You look at the work they're doing on education. There's a lot of amazing peace-making work going on around the globe, but it's not as good as it needs to be. It needs much stronger leadership, and we're going through a process now of selecting the next Secretary General, and it needs much more coherence. It needs to work together much more rather than against itself.
Well, if I may say so, that is sort of apple pie stuff. Nobody could really disagree with the thought, but it's not very specific. You are a former British diplomat who's now looking at the workings of the Security Council. Is it time to acknowledge that it makes no sense for Britain to have one of those permanent 5 seats, that Britain, as one relatively small, medium-sized nation, shouldn't be able to wield a permanent veto?
No, I mean, I disagree with that. And Britain's not exactly a big veto wielder anyway, but we're spending 2% on defence, we're spending 0.7% on aid. If you look at the hearings now for the Secretary General, it's the British ambassador who's out there asking the right questions, doing it incidentally, collecting ideas via Twitter. We're a major player in that space, and people want us there.
Yeah, but even Sir John Major, former British Prime Minister, has said the way the UN Security Council is configured at the moment is grotesquely out of date.
Well, I think you can argue that it's not fit for purpose. It's not doing all the things it's supposed to be doing. And Syria is a classic example of that.
Britain and France have 2 of the 5 seats indicative of this grotesquely out-of-date
I think it's much more about, as you say, much more about the way that Russia in particular has wielded the veto. That's my experience in Syria.
But Russia
I don't see the
still
problem with the
nuclear
Security Council
superpower.
as being Britain and France.
I mean, we and France have nuclear weapons, but we're part of the... Well, let's leave Britain and Brexit aside, but we're 2 medium-sized European states. What about India? What about Brazil? What about all of Africa? Are you saying the Security Council doesn't need a fundamental reconfiguration?
I'm sure it needs more voices. I'm sure we need to hear from South America, from Africa, from Asia to a far greater degree. But I don't think that means the UK and France giving up that position that they have on the Security Council.
Tom Fletcher, a diplomat to the end. I thank you for being on Hard Talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.